Hello, homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today on the podcast, we have a return guest, Steve McIntosh, talking about the presence of the infinite, the spiritual experience of beauty, truth, and goodness. That's right. But before we jump into this conversation around integral philosophy, some spiral dynamics, and the like, I just want to tell you that my book is out. That's right, Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, JC, Lord Liar, Lunatic, or just freaking awesome, is out. That's right, I've been told it is in the warehouses from places that you purchase. You see that? I'm tongue-tied because I'm just so excited that something I've been working on for a long time is out and headed to all the Homebrewed Christianity deacons who purchased its way. So if you're saying to yourself, I pre-ordered this book, I'm ready for it to come, it's coming my way, or I've been thinking about it, then let me tell you, the best time to do it is before November 8th of the year 2015, because if you pre-order it, purchase it, and send me proof of purchase before the 8th ends on the West Coast, then you'll not only get a copy of the Guide to Jesus, you'll get 6 90-minute sessions, high-gravity classes. You'll get Peter Rollins and I talking about radical theology, talking about Christology and atheism for Lent, and then you'll get a 4th class, Religion and Science with Philip Clayton. And if that's not enough, if you get 5 copies and send it, then you'll get a 5th class, Paul, Rupture, Revelation, and Revolution. You get 25 copies to use for a group, or just because you think handing an entire book out would be a fun way of proselytizing. I don't care. Send me proof of 25 or more copies, and then we'll set up time, a Skype session, and I'll join your small group, your discussion group, your book group, or you and the 24 people you put the book in their hands on the street. I don't care. And if you decide to jump in and get the entire series, all 10 volumes of the Homebrewed Guide series for $110 at homebrewedguides.com, you'll not only get the 10 guides with free shipping, a Homebrewed Christianity sticker, and Pine card, which is basically proof that you're a theology nerd that you can use regularly. You'll also get Radical Theology class, the Christology class, the Atheism for Lent class, Religion and Science class, the Theology Nerd Boot Camp, which is like a 5-hour introduction to progressive Christian theology with Scott Paith. You'll get my recent varieties of postmodern theology class, and the 6 small group video sessions with Rob Bell, Barry Taylor, and Peter Rollins called Revelation of Darkness. See, that's Trip's attempt to make you excited and decide to get his book. Now, if you are getting this and it has not got to the 8th yet, then know that on the 1st of November, I'll be preaching at my friend Todd's church in Snow Hill, Oklahoma. The next day, I'll be at Tapworks, November 2nd, for a live podcast, getting interviewed and tortured, skewered by Greg Horton about my book. The ex-pastor, agnostic, scholar of religion, is going to just let me have it about this Jesus book. There at Tapworks in Oklahoma City. The following night, I'll be joining a lot of my friends in Tulsa, Oklahoma from Phillips Theological Seminary, one of our favorite sponsors of the podcast. That night. Then the next day, Jack Caputo and I will be meeting in Springfield, Missouri at Brentwood Christian Church for a one-day theology nerd boot camp. Yeah, talking about God and philosophy, or how philosophers see God and how philosophers changed their view of God over time from the great big old being to immanent being to no being. Yeah, it's going to be freaking awesome. Yes, you know, I'm going to try not to poop my pants because I'll be teaching alongside Caputo. I'm going to have to keep a straight, confident face, not let him know how intimidating that is. Yeah, last time I taught in front of him, he came into a Sunday school classroom, didn't know he was coming, and I just started sweating profusely, and I don't even remember what I said. I just know it was not good, because I thought to myself, why is Jack Caputo in a Sunday school class that I'm teaching in? And why am I teaching? Because Jack Caputo's here. Yep, that's kind of how the lesson went. Anyway, we're going to have a lot of fun. Theology Nerd Boot Camp at Brentwood Christian Church. And then the 5th through the 7th at Drury University is Subverting the Norm, there's some crazy stuff that's going to go on at Subverting the Norm. I'll be doing a homebrewed session on Thursday night, a live podcast. I got tons of stuff planned. I'm going to do a keynote thingy about my book, and Johnny is going, and Johnny and I have some other goodness, so just be prepared. Make sure you're following at Trip Fuller on blab.im, the new video streaming interactive social media platform, because right there on Blab, we're going to do some crazy junk from Subvert the Norm. That's your heads up. Yeah, then after Subvert the Norm, I'm going to be preaching at Fayetteville, Arkansas. Headed off to Fayetteville, Arkansas that Sunday, which I think is the 8th of November. And I will be at my friend Christopher Dixon's church there in Fayetteville, preaching 3 services. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do at the second and third service, except say what I said at the first service with more accurately timed jokes. But if you want to check it out, the church is Christian Life Cathedral, and their website happens to just be christianlifecathedral.com. Fayetteville, Arkansas. Sue Pig, Suey. Then the 12th through the 14th is here in Redondo Beach. The most exciting, because it's the first event we've ever had at the Hatchery in Redondo Beach. Integral spirituality fun. Don Beck's going to be there. Rob Bell's going to be there, and a whole host of my other friends. And not only that, what else is it, Trip? What are you saying? Jürgen Moltmann. At the end of the month, on the 20th of November, you can sign up and live stream my conversation with Moltmann from the American Academy of Religion. If you were part of the AAR that Friday night, the 20th, you should come to the theater I rented and have a few beverages and enjoy some fun with Jurgi. All right? That's what I was saying. That's all I got. Just saying you should do that. All right, go to homebrewedchristianity.com. Find the details. homebrewedguides.com to get the guides. And make sure you forward me all the goodness to get your perks. Yeah. All right. Peace out. Steve McIntosh time. Talking about his new book, Presence of the Infinite. It was lots of fun. It is a time where I get all whitehead on top of Ken Wilber. Ooh, yeah. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today you are talking to Steve McIntosh. He's back on the podcast, but there are 20,000 more listeners since last time, and this is a conversation about his new book, The Presence of the Infinite. And
thank you, Trip. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, definitely. It's always good to find out that people agree to come back on the second time. That means I didn't fail. So one of the reasons that this conversation is going to be a lot of fun is it's setting up for you getting to come hang out with us in Los Angeles at the Hatchery at the Unfolding Spirituality Conference. So on top of all that, we have this book coming out perfect time, because one of the things I think you do well is in the text. Oh, excuse me. I just chugged carbonated water, which is I've got addicted to these things. This is a confession.
It's certainly better than soda.
Yeah, but these like grapefruit essenced sparkling water. Yeah. I don't, maybe it's just because I'm Christian that it's just so attractive, but those bubble water, man. In the last, my mother-in-law was here visiting. She got them. I started drinking them, and now it's like all day long. I just want these things.
It's good to burp. It's cathartic.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so in your book, it is engaging kind of the rise of spirituality, evolutionary panentheism, integral thought, and all these things, and arguing that we can have a more robust understanding of God than it kind of dominates new thought in the cultural marketplace. I loved it because anytime there are footnotes to kind of German idealists, I get excited. It makes me think of comprehensive exams and the PhD program. But before we get into the book, I think it'd be fun for you to say a little bit about yourself, because you aren't the normal picture of someone that writes large books with footnotes to dead Germans, to Nobel Prize winning scientists, to Eastern spiritual leaders and teachers, to medieval monks. Like, all those footnotes in there usually come because there's stacks of degrees, and you were actually successful at something real in the world, you like in business and things. So tell us how in the world this conversation ever exists in your biography.
Well, my background is I grew up in Los Angeles. My father was an atheist. My mother was agnostic. I was not raised in any religious tradition. But in the early 70s, I began to really sense that there was, more to the universe than I had been led to believe. And that is, I had a deep spiritual longing for truth and beauty and goodness. And that led me to become involved in the 70s with a emerging new form of spirituality, which I refer to in my book as progressive spirituality. The term New Age is not broad enough. We have to include Westernized Buddhism, progressive forms of Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, eco-spirituality, the whole countercultural alternative realm of spiritual truth, which we could trace probably back to Emerson and Thoreau in a way, but it really begins to become a significant market, demographic, cultural force in the 70s. Has been maturing through various phases in different decades since then. So I became identified with progressive spirituality as a teenager. And it's always been the sort of the main focus of my life. I guess I had a sense that I had missed the 60s. I was just a little too young, born in 1960. And that there was a renaissance going on, and I wanted to participate, and I was too young. So I got to the point where I felt like that the 60s wasn't the only renaissance on the horizon, that there was another spiritual renaissance that I was called to participate in my life. And in a sense, every part of my career has been focused on participating in that in one way or another. By the late 70s, I realized that just being a hippie and a counterculturalist I wasn't going to allow me to participate in society at the level that I thought, I could. So I wanted to go and get establishment credentials, right? So I went to business school and law school, practiced law for a while, got recruited to be part of a startup. Then that got acquired. I was an executive. Then around 94, I sensed that the spiritual renaissance that I had been anticipating all my life felt like there was inklings at the beginning of that in the 90s. And so I left my corporate job and started a company that was designed to anticipate the art movement that I thought would accompany the spiritual renaissance. So, the tagline of the company, Now and Zen, it was called, was cultural artifacts of the spiritual renaissance, right? And so just like a Tiffany lamp represents Art Nouveau, I wanted to create products that would have a motif that would be sacred geometry and Zen aesthetics. And so this company, Now and Zen, it's still going. It's 20 years old. But I realized I wasn't cut out to be a business person. I did okay, but that wasn't my calling. I was distracted. I wanted to participate in other things. And by the late 90s, I was also kind of disappointed with progressive spirituality. It didn't really produce the kind of spiritual renaissance that seemed to be its promise. And that led me to find and embrace this integral perspective, this evolutionary worldview. So in 2000, I joined Ken Wilber's Integral Institute. I was invited to be part of that. And I've kind of been in the integral movement, but I'm a little bit of the black sheep because I'm not a Wilberian. I always sort of was troubled a little bit by the belief system of Wilber, even though I could appreciate it, in a pluralistic way. I sort of felt like that his attempts to describe his spirituality as a kind of objective science of spirit just seemed wrong, because for me, the form of spirituality that I gravitated to most really centered around the love of God. And that was, missing to a large degree within Wilber's purview. And I respected that, but I didn't feel part of it. And so I was called, I knew that there was this integral emergence, this new worldview was bigger than any one person's philosophy. And that led me to work for several years to really produce my first book, which came out in 2007, Integral Consciousness. And then I was more involved with the integral movement at that point. I realized that the next book had to be more focused on the spirituality of evolution, how, in a sense, evolution is a spiritual teaching. That is a truth this big, a truth that we understand now, that there's a big bang 13.8 billion years ago, and time began, and then the universe evolved, and then life evolved, and now we're evolving, and there's a sort of through line that is, it's all forms of different kinds of becoming something more from something less in one giant structure of emergence. this, to me, was a truth so big that it had spiritual implications that couldn't be ignored, which led to the writing of Evolution's Purpose, my 2012 book.
Mm-hmm.
But that book was kind of written for modernists. It was written for scientific folks to try to show them the spirituality within the story of evolution.
Is that the time that you started the think tank and were working on using Integral for specific kind of global political social issues?
Well, after 2012, after Evolution's Purpose came out, it was around that time that I realized that not only did this integral perspective have significant spiritual implications, but it also had political implications. We sort of felt like there was a duty to try to bring the light of this understanding of the evolution of culture to difficult political problems that were impacted by the culture war, problems like climate change or political polarization itself, that we had some new insights that we thought could help there. And so this idea of creating a think tank the business model of which would be philanthropical funding, we benchmarked off other think tanks, none of which had the integral perspective as part of their secret sauce. So we realized there was room for an integral think tank in the marketplace of ideas, at least one that was specifically focused on influencing political opinion. Mm-hmm. So this led to the founding of the Institute for Cultural Evolution. We officially founded it in 2013. And it's grown, and we're on the verge of bringing in some significant philanthropical funding. We've attracted a lot of national media attention and some very influential people who are paying attention and appreciating our work. So the think tank's going great guns, but at the same time, my work has both a political dimension and an increasing spiritual dimension. And so this new book, The Presence of the Infinite, if I can mention the subtitle, is The Spiritual Experience of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness. Evolutionary spirituality, which is sort of the topic of the book, could also be called beauty, truth, and goodness spirituality, because that's sort of the focus and its method and a big part of the new truth that it's bringing, even though, this triad of values has been around since Plato at least. But so spiritual and political, and I've been working intensely like a dog on this think tank. Now I'm turning to my book tour, that the book's being released this week. So I'm excited to talk about that.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things that might, I think, be helpful in hearing your own biography is for those that aren't Los Angelites or live in Austin or San Francisco or these places where kind of progressive spirituality is something that is just part of the cultural landscape. Can you kind of identify ways that people that aren't in that type of culture could spot it? Maybe on TV, in the news, in kind of cultural markers? Because I think there is a hesitancy for Christians, especially in the West, because we've been culture dominant so long, that when we start hearing progressive spirituality, Western Buddhism, Vedanta, what's that? Is that someone's name? I don't know. Because there's so much newness and otherness to what you're saying, we just immediately get defensive. When if there's evidence of it, us interacting with it, incorporating it, responding to it in different ways, just laying there in front of us, we just don't ever use the phrase progressive spirituality. And you go at lengths to describe it specifically. So maybe you can share a little bit about that so that listeners that are unfamiliar with it can start to connect dots in their own life and kind of perspective on culture.
Sure. Well, chapter 1 of the book is called It's in Search of Spiritual Leadership. And there I talk about different kinds of spiritual leadership. Really, anything that create a spiritual experience in another person could be understood as a form of spiritual leadership. So we can see spiritual leadership through the heroes of history, in the arts, those who lead sacred causes. But in America, at least, in the marketplace of ideas, I argue that there are 3 major kinds of spirituality. That is, forms that provide identity and describe what's true and worthwhile. And of course, the biggest category of this is what I call religious spirituality. And that is the traditional Judeo-Christian heritage, which, we've inherited from our history and which still makes up probably 40% of the population identifies with religious spirituality, goes to church regularly. And that's a very important heritage of Western civilization and something that evolutionary spirituality does its best to honor and include, better than these other kinds. I talk a little bit about what I call secular spirituality or a spirituality, which could be defined as a new atheism or religious naturalism. And, this has both, all these forms. Religious spirituality has, fundamentalism, but it also has intellectually sophisticated theologians, of which, you and I know many.
Mm-hmm.
Secular spirituality has this sort of militant atheists sort of downside, but it also has, religious naturalists like Stuart Kaufman or Braun Taylor who do understand that there's a kind of a sacred dimension, even though they want to frame it in physicalist terms, right? So each one of these forms. Progressive spirituality is its own distinct form. And although there's a degree of overlap, progressive spirituality has emerged in the United States and elsewhere over the last 50 years. It sort of came out of the 60s, but it's not merely a 60s or a hippie kind of a thing. It emerged out of this postmodern or countercultural demographic of people, which is about 20% of the U.S., searching for spiritual alternatives, right? And then it was sort of rescued the religious impulse or spirituality from death at the hands of modernism, and sort of showed that even beyond a religious and a secular worldview, there's a way of reclaiming the sacred by finding it in new areas and new ways, of the wisdom of the East, the wisdom of the earth, lots of different new kinds or old kinds that are rediscovered within a Western cultural context, right? So if we were to identify these three kinds of spirituality, the thought leaders who, in a sense, exemplify them, the popular authors who, in a sense, frame these forms. For religious spirituality, we might identify Rick Warren, right, who sold 30 million books, A Purpose-Driven Life, right? There's plenty of other authors more intellectual than Warren, but he's certainly a spiritual leader and has brought spiritual experience to the lives of many, especially those who identify with religious spirituality. Within secular spirituality, we can pin it on Richard Dawkins, right? His book, The God Delusion, sold probably 4 million copies worldwide. And so Dawkins is sort of a pious atheist who in a sense, advances that form of spirituality as a competitor. It's competing with other forms of spirituality to provide identity and say what's real. And that's why it stands in as a form of spirituality. And then on the progressive side, we could probably identify Eckhart Tolle, whose book, The Power of Now, sold 4 million copies, as a good example of a thought leader who is in this milieu of progressive spirituality. And of course, we could point to, Oprah Winfrey or Deepak Chopra or some of the other well-known sort of celebrity authors and thought leaders in the progressive spiritual culture. But again, there's all kinds of different forms of progressive spirituality. There's the sort of pseudoscientific magical thinking of the extreme New Age versions, which are, the downside of it, in my opinion. But then there's intellectually sophisticated authors within the progressive spiritual space, like A.H. Almaas or Stanislav Grof or, Ken Wilber himself has been a leader within progressive spirituality, even though he's, kind of really, I chart him as part of this integral or evolutionary worldview. Over the last decades, progressive spirituality has garnered a significant share of the marketplace of ideas when it comes to spirituality. In the 90s, it had a kind of a fluorescence, a sort of heyday. Progressive spiritual books are, this sort of new age category was the largest category in the publishing industry by far. And thousands of new age bookstores had opened across the country, and it was a real movement. And although it's faded to a degree, it remains a large demographic within American society, as seen in yoga culture and in the way it has impacted traditional forms of spirituality, either making them more traditional or more progressive. Sort of the vibrant middle has kind of been polarized. So, we could spend the hour talking about progressive spirituality, but that's a sort of a little bit of a framing of it.
So, in one of the things that I find helpful in kind of your turn towards evolutionary spirituality is how evolution gives us a way from all three perspectives of seeing our relationship between each other differently. Right? Like I'm perfectly comfortable being a Christian, but here's once the great chain of being of some transcendent absolute deity who's unchanged and set this chain in locked order permanently once does not compute, when it doesn't cohere to the actual world we call the good creation God made and gave for us to care and love and live in, then once you make that shift from this transcendent great being to one that we live, move, and have our being in, once you kind of switch your perspective of God to one that's much more cohesive with the scriptures, to a kind of evolutionary panentheism, then I think as a Christian, if that's who God is, the one who is the God of the Hittites and the Hebrews, right? Then you expect to find traces and the fruits of God's own relationship with people across cultures and in different perspectives. And there's this kind of absolutist version of religion where your tradition then become walls that shape the way you look across the rampart towards like progressive spirituality, or you're like or towards scientism and that kind of thing. But once you kind of make the shift towards a panentheistic world, you start to see ways in which the God as Christians we see came to be with us in Christ, always having been coming to be present in beauty, truth, and goodness development across cultures, situations, and things. Like God's just in the business of bringing beauty, truth, and goodness into being. And that kind of breaks down. So no longer science an enemy of faith, but an ally. So where is truth erupting there, and how can it impact us? No longer is Ken Wilber an enemy to our faith, but an ally in places. So, like, one of the things I find fascinating about your own story is you never use the phrase Christian for yourself, but you're totally into Jesus. And
I am a follower of Jesus, no question about it.
Right. That's so. I'm interested in how, when we pick very particular phrases or ways of capturing our religious identity, how does your allegiance, identification with Jesus, and in clear love for the Christian tradition, like you read it on its own terms well, unlike you read Dawkins and you think you just failed philosophy 101. I'm sorry, but you may have sold a lot of books, but you didn't pass intro to philosophy of religion. Like, you don't do that, and you read fairly people across, like Sierra Bindu, you read fairly. So, like, how do you understand your own connection to Jesus and this kind of open relationship with these different spiritual centers, be it traditions, progressive spirituality, science, and things?
Sure. Well, this new emergent form of spirituality, which can be contrasted with progressive, religious, and secular, for lack of a better word, evolutionary spirituality is what the label I'm using. You could also call it integral spirituality. None of these labels are satisfactory. They all have baggage in their own way. But evolutionary spirituality is attempting to push off against and transcend, while include, the best of what has come before. And so right now it's emerging out of progressive spirituality, but we're trying to make a kind of a dialectical separation where we're saying progressive spirituality has made major accomplishments by sort of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, by reclaiming all the different forms, but through intense pluralism and relativism. And yet it's also been doing a job in history of pushing off against the establishment, right? It comes out of these countercultural roots. So the Judeo-Christian religious establishment has been something that both modernism, the sort of mainstream secular spirituality, and progressive spirituality have both been attempting to sort of escape the orbit or the gravity of that, right? And they can see it as patriarchal and exclusive, and there's many reasons why they can't abide by traditional forms, but they know that there's more to the universe than matter in motion. So progressive spirituality is a sort of our point of departure. And one of the ways we depart from that is by seeing how, rather than a kind of anything goes pluralism, there's a deeper understanding of spiritual truth that can be gained. And this involves partially recognizing that progressive spirituality has, as it's developed over the last 50 years, one of the ways that's rediscovered spirituality is by recognizing the sort of what I call the non-dual pole of spiritual experience and truth teachings, right? That is, non-duality is a concept of ultimate reality that recognizes sort of no separation. Another word would be pantheism or, monism. There's all kinds of different philosophical terms. But the idea that there's no separation, that we're all one thing, that we all share the exact same being, and that's all there really is. These are spiritual teachings that are found both within Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta Hinduism. And there's a rich spiritual tradition there that's been gradually going through a kind of an amalgamation or even a merger through the teachings of Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, non-duality. And, Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, the non-duality of Buddhism. These are kind of coming together, which sort of shows this what I call, it's like an attractor basin of spiritual experience that has its own practices, right? So meditation, more than anything else, is a practice which leads to all kinds of different forms of spiritual experience. But at the very depth of this attractor basin is this profound, universal spiritual experience that have been described by mystics down through the ages. It's called the unitive experience, or samadhi, right? Where there's subject and object collapse into one unified experience. It's life-changing. It's hyper-lucid. This unitive spiritual experience, which has been experienced by Christians, such as Saint Teresa or other Christian mystics, is a kind of an experiential foundation of all the forms of non-duality, which have been gradually brought together within progressive spirituality. But the teachings and the practices and the experiences of non-duality, in a sense, stand in contrast to many of the important teachings and practices of theistic or panentheistic spirituality, right? And because of my association with this, I knew that there was a sort of another attractor basin of spiritual experience who had its own apogee, which I describe as the love of God. So just as meditate, and you can have all kinds of different experiences, but at the height of meditation is this experience of oneness, unity. If you have faith and you pray and you practice the theistic practices that lead to theistic spiritual experiences, this feeling of the love of God, that the love of the Creator for you as a creature, that God knows and loves you as an individual and cares about you as a person, that's a thrilling confirmation of one's faith. And I've had this experience many times, and largely through my trying to live the teachings of Jesus. In other words, Jesus' teaching about the love of God and the family of humanity is even though there are non-dual elements of Jesus' teaching, his teaching falls onto this theistic side.
Yeah. And so you would say something like, when Jesus says the rain falls on the good and the bad, he's going, hey, non-duality. Or when you pray, go into your inner room, and those type of things, when they didn't even have inner rooms then. So like he has these elements of non-dual spiritual practice, but you don't want to equate that or call it, hey, everyone, you're all doing the same thing. When we say non-duality, that's the same thing as love your neighbor as yourself. Or you're trying to draw a contrast to these two different elements without one eating the other. Is that the tension?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the things that evolutionary spirituality discloses as evolutionary perspective is that evolution proceeds, its main pattern and process is dialectical development, right? Thesis, antithesis. And one of the ways that dialectical development is actualized is through the sort of the harmonization of indestructible polarities, interdependent existential polarities, like male and female, or freedom and order, or support and challenge, or competition and cooperation. Even beauty and truth, in a way, are they're not the same thing. They complement each other, but they also, in a sense, challenge each other. There's a sort of a tension, and it's in the tension energy of these natural polarities that this engine of evolution can be understood. So this polarity theory, this is kind of a new addition to integral philosophy, which is very useful for appreciating the landscape of spiritual experience and teaching that we're in, at this time in history. Mm-hmm. And by using this polarity, we can discover that, unlike progressive spirituality, which for evolutionarily appropriate reasons, it sort of has a leveling or homogenizing tendency. It wants to say that all spiritual paths lead to the top of the same mountain, that they're all saying the same thing in different ways. That again, that's a way of rescuing spirituality and being inclusive in a kind of a postmodern or progressive frame. So that I don't want to say that's all wrong, but I want to say going beyond that, pushing off against the limitations of that, we can begin to get a more sophisticated appreciation of what's going on here, that theism and non-duality are not just different paths to the top of the same mountain. They're a real polarity.
So singing Kumbaya as we all go up the same mountain is better than using swords and chasing some down, but that's not the end of the story. And I really think that a part of that actually has to do with the growth in each side, right? So in experiences and articulation of non-duality, this morning the Pope talks. The Pope it sits in the Congress and tells everyone about Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. Now, Dorothy Day, if you want to talk about what a Catholic beautiful example of what radical love of God looks like, it's Dorothy Day and the Catholic social worker movement. Because nothing exemplifies the love of God according to actual Catholic teachings more than loving your neighbor as yourself. And she said, and that part about loving your enemies and the poor and oppressed that Jesus said, he really meant it. Right? And he sets that right next to Thomas Merton, who, if you think of what in the Catholic tradition exemplifies sitting so silently in the presence of the infinite that you recognize a brother and sisterhood with others, where your identity in baptism, you realize that the baptismal waters, that junk goes really, really deep. And that water's been showing up in wells you've never tasted from before. Right. And that isn't a threat to the intimacy you discovered at your baptism. It's actually contagious for you to go explore it. And Merton becomes the one that pushed the edges by just praying with people of other faiths and building bridges. And, and the Pope sits them both there as examples of, in the biggest binary room that capitalism can purchase, as examples. But those two function, right, as fruits in the religious tradition that actually equip us as Christians to move beyond our tribal identity. Both of them succeeded by going, okay, you don't really need to go to confession all the time if that's really not where you are, if you were abused and stuff, as long as we are meeting Christ in the poor. And Dorothy Day famously did that. And Merton's like, let us share the experience and prayer together and build bridges without switching teams, because there's no need for our teams to be competitive. We can be cooperative. We can mutually be transformed. So, like, when you are looking at this from the outside and going, wow, Team Jesus is discovering stuff Jesus was totally into, and from your evolutionary spirituality, like, how would you diagnose or articulate those things, kind of looking from the outside versus us as Christians going, yeah, they're being really good Christians. Like, how, from your perspective, do you start to see alliances and openings being brought into being that maybe we didn't know were there as they were growing?
Sure. Well, first of all, developing for Christians a more sophisticated understanding of non-duality, as Buddhism specifically, but the other forms of non-duality that are now kind of included within this progressive spiritual non-dual complex. How the teachings and the practices and the experiences of non-duality they can really help deepen a theistic practice, both by complementing it and by contradicting it. Mm-hmm. In other words, they're not the same thing. And to try to say they're the same or they're ultimately the same, I think is to miss an opportunity to have a deeper and more robust understanding of spiritual truth and spiritual experience. So the way we can see that is that love, the love of God, this apogee of the spiritual experience of the theistic path, is irreducibly relational. Right? Love doesn't make any sense if there's not at least two entities that can love and be loved, creature and creator, at this level. But the teachings of non-duality, in a sense, fly in the face of that by saying that there's no separation, and that the teachings are an illusion, that all notions of separation are an illusion. And we don't need to make that entirely wrong, even though it conflicts and contradicts. This practice of integrating and harmonizing existential polarities allows both sides to true each other up, right? So there's sort of an intuition that there's some deep truths within Buddhism that are challenging truths, but don't necessarily have to just be sort of accepted as contradictory without remainder. In other words, that the challenge can be can allow us to understand the love of God more deeply. And part of this involves this spiritual truth about ultimate reality, right? So what's ultimately real? For non-dualists, ultimate reality is the non-dual oneness of the universe. For Christians and other theists, ultimate reality is the loving creator, God, the Father and Mother of the universe. And understanding how the practice of these two different kinds of spirituality, even though one can be primarily on a theistic path, practicing non-duality within a theistic context can really help us appreciate God more fully. Just like practicing the love of God in the context of a non-dual spiritual practice also highlights that. So in other words, at the traditional level, the idea is to find a form of spirituality or religion that resonates best, make that religion your own truth, and practice it as deeply as you can go. When we transcend the traditional level of religious development at the progressive side, it's more eclectic. It's more cafeteria style, right? You just sort of take spiritual truth wherever you can find it. But it sort of remains unintegrated for most practitioners. It's sort of like it's more about beauty and goodness than it is about truth, about the rigor of theology. It doesn't really play. It's more about practice and experience, which is, again, evolutionarily appropriate. But now we can go beyond the sort of the limited purview of progressive spirituality, its kind of countercultural status, and search for forms of spiritual leadership that can reclaim truth, reclaim theology as fortified by what I call the spiritual teachings of evolution. Mm-hmm. The universe is intelligible, that there is value being created by evolution. These propositions of spiritual truth, human free will, are ungrounded at best and denied at worst within non-dual spiritual teachings.
Yeah.
And yet non-duality has something very important to offer. So finding a way that doesn't try to say they're the same thing, which is untrue, like many kind of progressive Christian teachers are sort of doing now in a way that I think is, again, it's part of progressive spirituality, but I think we can do better. I think there's something truer out there.
Yeah.
And that greater truth is found in this kind of practicing one pole with a reference to the other. So if we think about a yin-yang symbol, right, there's a white dot and the black wave and the black dot and the white wave. And I'm not suggesting that theism and non-duality are perfectly a mirror of each other in that way, but to the extent that the yin-yang symbol represents a sort of principle of interdependent polarities, we can see that at the evolutionary level, practicing theism in its fullness means finding a place for the black dot within the white wave. Practicing non-duality means understanding that there is this kind of loving source that doesn't really fit within non-dual teachings of no separation or no free will or no individual self.
Yeah.
So how can it be true that we are, individual beings in our own right who are original and who can be loved and loved, as nodes of cosmic agency, and that's a sort of big part of theistic spirituality. How can that be true in the face of the teachings of no self, right? Which is a central tenet of Buddhism. And yet they can both be true without rupturing the unity of truth when we understand that these polar veils of ultimate reality that we're encountering in spiritual experience and spiritual teaching are sort of the way this higher unity appears in the finite. Here we are in the finite. It's refracted into part and whole, self and other. And so even though non-duality teaches that, there is only one thing, we can begin through practice and discernment to make that true without erasing or subordinating this other challenging truth that God loves us as individuals.
Yeah, and I think that's important because I know, one, if you are a philosophical theologian and then you have progressive Christian friends who aren't one, discover non-duality, and they start reading Meister Eckhart, and Richard of Saint Victor, or these kind of things, and then you're like, yes, this is great. This is one of the rich parts of the Christian tradition. And then the next thing you know, when they start talking about non-duality, you're like, oh, hold on, okay, yes, that's part of the Christian tradition, and now your conclusions are that the Christian tradition's actually inherently wrong, and that everything that the prophets were obsessed with is secondary. The kingdom of God that Jesus inaugurated, embodied, made present, and called us to live and participate in is tertiary, and that what God calls ultimate, the image-bearing creatures and the world that is the good creation, are hindrances to getting to where we're going. Like, we need to address we're talking about two different things, and they have a beautiful relationship, as opposed to having experience in non-duality is so intoxicating the first time. It's so beautiful. I don't want to share them on the internet, but I remember the temptation of just the first time Meister Eckhart didn't sound like a pothead to me. Right, like the first time I thought, oh, that's what he meant. Like the looking at his son in a mirror thing. Okay. and you know it like after you experience it, and then the ideas make some sense. Like, but it's so easy just to shed things. So it's easy for Christians when they start hearing people talk about non-duality. If you haven't had the experience, to go, whoa. I know you have glaucoma and you got a prescription because I don't know where else this is coming from. It's not Amos. And you just you have that response. But also if you've had the experience, you go, no, like whatever I'm tasting there, is this connected in some real intimate way to what I've been looking for and connected to all along. How is it that you take that insight and then run it through your own kind of relationship and understanding of as a follower of Jesus?
Sure. Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, in the book, I talk about practicing one pole with a reference to the other. And so a key to practicing non-duality in the context of loyalty, to the teachings of Jesus, is understanding what's called the apophatic role of the non-dual pole of spiritual experience and teachings. Apophatic means getting to the truth by what it's not, right? So Meister Eckhart had one of my favorite quotes is, only the hand that erases can write the true thing. Even the word non-dual is thoroughly apophatic, and it's not this, it's not that. It's not the finite. That is the infinite, which we can understand as both non-duality and a loving creator, is certainly beyond the finite universe of our minds and time. And so beyond that, there's an element or an aspect or an experiential reality of the infinite, in which the finite itself is negated. The finite itself is erased. And that erasure of separation, that erasure of individuality or particularity or time, space, matter, energy, in a sense, the fact that is rendered into just one simple, formless, non-dual thing or no thing it's a powerful revelatory experience that chastens and improves a theistic spiritual path. But the key to the practice for theists is to not let that powerful truth completely erase. In other words, it's a truth that's true but partial. Mm-hmm. Because it exists in this polar relationship with an equal and opposite truth, right? Houston Smith is famous for saying that the opposite of a small truth is a falsehood, but the opposite of a great truth is an equal and opposite truth. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we're encountering in these attractor basins, if you will, of the non-dual spiritual experience and the experience of the love of God and all the different theistic forms of spiritual experience, like the beautiful, the true, and the good, which are relational, which are an individual experience. The thing about this non-dual unitive experience, this samadhi experience we've been talking about, is that one of the benefits of it is it's completely trans-conceptual. But because it's trans-conceptual, it doesn't really lend itself well to conceptual claims of belief system superiority. So the idea that non-dual is the highest truth and that theism is sort of relegated to the mythic level, that's a move that progressive spirituality, some progressive spiritual authors have made, like Ken Wilber, which as those who know the love of God in our hearts, as followers of Jesus, we can say, well, no, it's not subordinate. It's, but we don't have to try to do a one-upmanship either. We don't have to say, well, no, it's ours, not yours. We can say, wow, look, these are both true. They're both partial. They're both pointed to something that's way beyond our current experience or understanding. But these polarities are engines of evolution themselves. That is, this newly realized understanding of this polarity of non-duality and the love of God itself can lead to a higher form of spirituality that's emerging in our time. So it's an exciting time to be alive, and evolutionary spirituality is really beginning to demonstrate its leadership potential.
In there's a number of different ways philosophical theologians have attempted to kind of connect non-duality and theism without subsuming one and the other. And one of them actually is the concept of the infinite. For most of philosophical history, Greek philosophy, Christian one until evolution, essentially, the infinite was always contrasted with the finite. And then in the 19th century, as evolutionary philosophy first starts emerging, and people like Hegel, Schelling, Sciarra Bindu, and things, the notion of the infinite became not a ontological contrast with the finite, but it had an inclusive relationship where the infinite includes the finite in its identity, but is more than it, versus the infinite is precisely not finite in a contrasting way. And and so I'm interested in how that notion of the infinite you see being something that's helpful in connecting dots and building bridges today.
Sure, excellent question. Thank you. In the book, The Presence of the Infinite, I say that whatever spirit is, the idea that it's infinite is a widely acceptable kind of umbrella agreement that maybe both non-dualists and theists can agree upon, right? Of course, the spirit is much more than simply infinity. And I'm not just talking about a quantitative infinity. I'm also talking about a metaphysical, qualitative infinity of the encompassing, container. That is the finite. We know from evolution, became a part of the infinite 13.8 billion years ago. And yet, even though that the finite is sort of surrounded and contained by a transcendent infinite, the infinite is also in the center. The infinite also is immanent in the finite. It shines through the finite, or the finite becomes thin to reveal the infinite that's sort of there all along, upholding the universe from within. And this connects to the beautiful, the true, and the good, which I argue are these experiences, especially when they're experienced as a spiritual experience unto themselves, are an encounter with the presence of the infinite in the finite, right? So that beauty is a way, is sort of the infinite shining through in our senses. It's sort of a little glimpse of perfection. To the extent that something's beautiful, its evolution can proceed no further, even though, there's always more. The beauty is just little glimmers of completion that are shining through into the finite. I mean, the non-dual teacher Ramana Maharshi talked about the idea of the finite universe is like a movie being projected on the screen, and the infinite is like the screen behind. And when the movie becomes, when the film is sort of white or whatever, you can see through to the screen. And the same could be said conceptually about the infinite. Now, the idea that the infinite is immanent and transcendent, that it is at once non-dual and also loving. These are ways we can begin to explore a deeper and more philosophically and theologically robust understanding of what it is that we're encountering. I mean, as I argue, the beautiful, the true, and the good are not an analogy of the infinite. They're literally the infinite in our experience, right? To the extent that something's beautiful, true, or good, there's little flashes of perfection. And these elements of perfection are the comprehensible elements of divinity in time.
How do you see the good, true, and beautiful? As they're Platonic forms, right? Like that Plato put these forth as forms. These kind of ideals that have relation to the partial finite expressions, and a lot of evolutionary accounts of it. They have a productive relationship or a generative relationship with finitude. How do you see the concepts of, or what do you see beauty, truth, and goodness corresponding to in relationship to the spirit-world relation?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of different ways of getting at them. I mean, evolutionary spirituality certainly attempts to transcend static notions of Platonic forms, right? The sort of pre-modern ideas of value realism, while have important elements of truth, we're going beyond that. We're using very important insights of constructivism and postmodern philosophy to reclaim value realism in a way that doesn't simply make a thing out of it. One ways of describing the beautiful, the true, and the good are kind of, I'll use a variety of different ways. One would be thinking about it as aliveness, or as the flowering of the real, that which in our experience, which is sort of most valuable or attractive. Another way is understanding them as sort of vectors or lines, sort of rather than things, they're directions of development, right? So goodness, in a way, is like perfection's plumb line. It's a sort of a vector of value gravity. Whitehead called it a lure, and it definitely has a gravity and an eros which attracts us. So if we think about the beautiful, the true, and the good, not as static things, but as directions of perfection, perfecting, unity, unifying. I mean, the presence of the infinite in the finite is always a sort of a critique, because, the infinite is final and the finite is becoming, right? The being and the becoming, when they interact, the becoming is made more real. That is, the beauty makes things more spiritually real. Truth makes our mental conceptual world more real by definition. And so this idea that the beautiful, the true, and the good are the shining of the infinite into the finite. Another way to appreciate them, and as I argue in the book, they're messages of love. So the beautiful is got a message which is feel loved. The pleasure and the delight and all the exquisite ways that we can be rewarded aesthetically in our lives is a way of feeling the love of God, right? Truth is got another message behind it. The message is grow, that the universe is intelligible, that we can find more and more truth and become more real in the process. That truth is a direction of spiritual growth, right, for ourselves. And goodness too, it's a message of love. Love others is the key message that comes from that experience.
What I find interesting is Whitehead adds adventure and zest to the kind of eternal virtues, and he's doing it, out of trying to develop a metaphysics in light of quantum mechanics, that kind of stuff, but also evolutionary accounts of the world. And it's called process philosophy, but he liked calling it philosophy of organism. And one of the things I really like about that is often when we start to talk about beauty, truth, goodness in these abstract ways, it becomes the impetus of the religious teacher or the theologian or whatever to figure out ways we can kind of get them sometimes to interact with us or maybe make connections. But when we recognize that there is a sacred divine connection to adventure and to zest, then those kind of distant off type of virtues become the things that are sitting in the midst of our mundane existence waiting to come into being, that they're before us, provoking and calling and erupting through all these things we think have to be the case about our lives, our world, the relationships. Evolutionary spirituality to me is a way of seeing, especially within the Christian tradition, that God's present and on the move and calling us to be a part. And I think you could restate everything you said in Christianese, and it would sound like an edgy evangelical sermon, or a mainline Protestant person who had a process person or a Tillich scholar as their theology professor, right? Like those type of things are there. And one of the things I thought reading the book, and we talked about it when we were hanging out with Doug up in Colorado, and Doug's going to be at the Enfolding Spirituality event, which would be fun to pick the conversation up. Doug King. Anyway, so when you were talking about trying to figure out the yin yang image and ultimate reality, John Cobb, process theologian, likes to say that there's something to gain when Whitehead has more than one ultimate. That when we try to have one ultimate reality and make it God, or make it the non-dual no thing, then we end up doing this kind of collapse that's problematic for the wisdom from the West, out of Abraham's friends, and from the East, and that creativity in process thought is ultimate reality, but God is ultimate actuality, and the world, history, is that spiritual ongoing relationship between the two. And I have thought from the moment I first read process thought in college, after my first kind of intense contemplative experiences, that it made really good sense to me to go, yeah, we're doing very different things. And so you can be a Christian who sees God having redeemed you and are calling you to be part of redeeming the world, which is God's mission about very particular historical injustices, reality, shame, guilt, and all these things we carry. And at the same time, we're learning to seek enlightenment and recognizing this principle of identity, that we're all creatures of creativity, that all the things we hold dear and our ego seizes on, that we then pollute with power and privilege and all these things, are not ultimately real. But the injustice and interrelational perversions are actual. And God intends to redeem and change and set free and liberate and return from exile and all these things there. And recognizing them as separate, to me, sees evolutionary spirituality as a Christian. Like, I see a call to be transformed by the Eastern religions because they have been attending to part of the world with an intensity that we haven't. And in the same way, we, like Merton, can point out ways in which we can help encourage and partner to do things like specifically addressing injustices. That picture is what I imagine. It's inspiring to me, and so I'm wondering how that type of the recognition philosophically of more than one ultimate, if that helps address those issues, or is that a way of not a different way of not addressing it?
Right. Well, I think clearly the ultimate is not plural in the sense that it's simply a polarity. Obviously, I think that it's the three that are two that are one. I have a Trinitarian conception of ultimate reality, and so the Trinity we would expect, in a way, theologically, that as it refracts in the finite universe, we'd experience it as a duality, seeking a thesis and antithesis, seeking a synthesis. Mm-hmm. So it's a dynamic process, which goes back to the idea that the presence of the infinite is itself a verb. So. I want to circle back to what you said about Whitehead's including adventure and zest in his recognition of the beautiful, the true, and the good, because I think that really proves or underlines the point that these are directions of evolution, that contained within them are the sort of the practices of perfecting the universe, perfecting self, culture, and our relationship to nature. This is what evolutionary spiritualities focus on, is on evolution, is development, is on spiritual growth. And understanding spiritual growth in terms of the beautiful, the true, and the good, in terms of the spiritual experience that can be had within the depths of these truths. The practice of these values is an adventure. It is about the zest of them. It transforms our thinking about spirituality from something we get to something we give. These are comprehensible elements of data. They're like the handles on spirit, the things that we can co-create to make the universe increasingly more perfect, more real. We're agents of evolution, and this is a very important truth that's being brought back at a higher level. We're bringing it back partially by building on the accomplishments of non-duality. In other words, we're standing on the shoulders of non-duality, not just culturally, but in terms of spiritual teaching. And, this is leading to some exciting, sort of new horizons of what it means to understand spiritual truth, to do spiritual practice, to provide spiritual leadership, and to make the world a better place in the process. It's sort of a complex but simple theological perspective that transcends and includes the best of what's come before.
Mm-hmm. And one of the phrases that has come up is that transcend and include, and it's something that was really developed in a very rich way through spiral dynamics. And one of the things in your work that you've done is help everyone see the power of spiral dynamics, but also attempt to bring a richer spiritual connection to what most people identify like as just general spiral dynamics teaching. Could you kind of talk about the relationship of your version of a theistic integral thought in connected to the spiral? Because we're going to get to see it happen in action, which would be fun when you're out here with Beck.
Sure. Well, I would say this idea of transcendence and inclusion is a way of describing the structure of emergence, right? Since the Big Bang, something more keeps coming from something less, right? Whether it's a periodic table or the biological tree of life or human history and culture. And as I argue, both in evolution's purpose and the presence of the infinite, the structure of emergence has, even though there's, the physiosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere in Teilhardian terms, the structure of emergence continues to transcend and include. Transcending and including is another way of talking about the dialectic, right? The antithesis transcends and the synthesis includes, right? So this is evolution's primary technique of development. And we can see it occurring in human culture through the stages, the dialectically related stages of development that forms this sort of internal cultural ecosystem, which we understand through the stages of consciousness and culture that are identified and described by integral philosophy. Now, spiral dynamics is a particular version of this integral philosophical teaching of stages. It's been highly simplified, which is a strength that makes it very accessible to people. But the very ways that it's been simplified in a kind of an overly linear way, and the way it's been used for sort of organizational development consulting makes it sort of philosophically not as robust as the more mature expressions of integral philosophy have come to appreciate. So we're going beyond spiral dynamics while honoring it. We're trying to transcend and include spiral dynamics itself. So, I can, honor it and say I've gotten a lot out of it, but I've also gotten a lot of guff from other intellectuals, who are modernists or postmodernists, who look at spiral dynamics and say, oh, well, that's way too simplistic or it's theoretically problematic. And I agree with them because as it's presented in that sort of accessible organizational development, system, it leaves out a lot and pays the price for that accessibility. So we try to rehabilitate it at this idea of stages of cultural evolution at a more sophisticated level that's not as linear and that's more philosophically aware of the critiques that have been leveled against it.
Mm-hmm. But and as someone working in a think tank to address particular issues, it's wonderfully helpful when trying to get people on the same page to think about ways of communicating to large audiences in different cultures and that kind of stuff. And one of the things I think that's important for leaders, be it in a religious community, political ones, or cultural ones, to recognize is sometimes it's okay to thin the forest out to get more people to cooperate together. And then there are other times to sit in a room with people that really enjoy middle shelling more than later shelling. And both have their time and their place. And so that's one of the reasons I'm real excited that you're coming out to California, other than hanging out, is because it's going to be fun to have people who have connected through progressive spirituality, through contemplative Christian spirituality, to from evangelicalism to mainline Protestants who are very progressive, all going to have a conversation about what spirituality, community practice, and leadership looks like, taking seriously our interconnectedness and our spot and responsibility in the evolutionary story. So I'm pretty pumped about it. And who doesn't like hearing stories from Beck about working to end apartheid?
Well, sure. And now we're working to end polarization on climate change here in America.
Oh.
And doing it through, in one of the ways, by helping appreciate and understand the impact for good and bad of this postmodern or green worldview. Mm-hmm. And that was, in a sense, Clara Graves' biggest innovation was framing more clearly than ever before how postmodernism is its own worldview that can be contrasted and compared to traditionalism and modernism, which people can see. Modernists can see traditionalism and modernism. But the idea that there's this third level, that's what sort of makes us appreciate that there's actually an evolutionary structure, a structure of emergence that transcends and includes, that has dialectical relationships, and that by understanding this, we can emerge beyond all three, traditional, modern, and postmodern, by including the best of all three in this transcendent, emergence.
Because when you know where people are, then you're able to actually love, serve, care, encourage, and empower them in ways that they can actually receive. It's like if you were like, hey, Trip, did you know that humans can run a marathon? Go. It's not going to work today. A year from now, I could run a marathon. You know what I'm saying? Like, so many of us have these different places where our different levels in different parts of our lives, and wise, attentive leadership is being able to join people where they are and help them make the next best step at the stage they're at in a given situation, and not be like you're tempted to just say everyone understand the issue of police violence against African American men in the same way I do and address it how I do. And then you end up polarizing people rather than working with people where they are to get an actual better conclusion. And or church budgets. You will have traditionalists who assess the value of the budget by preserving the organ and new carpet. You will have modern people who are wanting to invest in education program, specifically ones that address the questions they have, and getting their children over dumb mythology and magic thinking that these traditionalists still are hooked on too often. And the postmodern people are like, why do we spend so much money on education and our building? Because there are poor people and we should do more of that. And each one has something beautiful to bring to the congregation. And if they are the lone voice, end up actually doing harm to other people. And I know you either have this, let's just get so there's almost no difference in mindsets with the people you're with, or figure out how to transcend any one but include them all in healthy and fruitful ways. And recognizing that activity is a spiritual one is really important.
Right. It's a truth practice, right? A big component of the integral consciousness, as it's called, or making meaning at this evolutionary postmodern level of understanding. We recognize postmodernists and their values within us. We also do that by making a room for modernist values and traditional values, that those are, in a sense, this internal cultural ecosystem that I'm talking about exists within us. And being able to understand how there is a place where all these different competing, dialectically related values can harmonize with each other without going to relativism. See, that's the trick, is that we're not just saying it's all good, it's all the same. That's what postmodernism does. We then transcend postmodernism and say, look, there's a vertical dimension of development. We reclaim the idea of which way is up. And, that recognition of values that's both inclusive and transcendent is, kind of the essence of what it means to have an integral perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thomas Keating, who's a contemplative Catholic a teacher, he said that how you perform contemplation and when arguing with an opponent is to ask yourself, well, they are right, so how? And starting to see these situations where we have to either be the opponent, it's either this or that, as a time where you take the mature position to go, well, they are right, so how? Not like they're completely right, but they're not completely wrong, and it's your responsibility to attend to the truth and beauty and goodness in the person you thought you should be set against. And so many times it takes us recognizing the big picture to imagine being responsible and mature in situations where that's called for. Right? Like if the story you tell yourself is an either or story, then you tend to perform it really, really well.
Right, and that's a way of thinking that may be appropriate for earlier times in history or different life conditions. But now we've got the life conditions that allow us to see truth more clearly as a ladder of distinctions, with every rung in the ladder as being very important, but every rung being true but partial. Even our own perspective, this evolutionary perspective, is true but partial, and invites its own transcendence by a higher and more inclusive level that'll push off against its shortcomings. But we have to climb on one rung at a time, and we're now grasping for this higher rung and trying to pull it into history in the moment. Mm-hmm. And it's bearing some beautiful spiritual fruits, which is, in a sense, the evidence of its truth.
Yeah. Plus, since we keep having kids, they all start out at the bottom, and you have to go through each stage. So I think that recognition is one of those ways that we need to start recognizing the responsibility of any religious tradition is actually to be a community that creates space where people can evolve through different relationships to beauty, truth, and goodness.
Indeed. Those are the directions of evolution.
That's why parenting is the most difficult task you'll ever get.
Well, but also how, for me at least, parenting has been the most important spiritual practice, if I can call it that.
I think it should be. It
puts me more in touch with the love of God than a love that I have for my sons.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Well, you ended on a sermon. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait for you to come out here, and we'll have to connect soon because I have an idea for the podcast part of the conference of a game we can play that I'm not going to tell you now because then you'll feel compelled to say yes since it's being recorded, and I don't want to coerce you. I want to lure you. I'm going to lure you.
Lure me with the higher truth of the podcast.
All right.
Definitely.
So thank you so much for writing The Presence of the Infinite. I think everyone should go check it out on get it wherever you get books. You can click through. There'll be links on the podcast post page. And you have a website with tons of other resources like videos of you talking about each of your texts, articles, connections to the a number of different groups you're part of, so you can find out about what this looks like in different political policies, to practice, to engaging other religious traditions, scientists. So But what's your website so people can find all the links?
Sure. The headquarters for my work as an author is stevemcintosh.com. It's MC McIntosh. And then the Institute for Cultural Evolution, that website is culturalevolution.org. And of course, they're cross-linked, but stevemcintosh.com is where I'd point people first.
All right. Awesome. Well, I hope you have a great day.
I just want to tell you that the homebrewed Christianity is a major spiritual fruit, and I'm honored to be part of it. And thanks a lot for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. And we will get to do it again in person.